Hello, everybody. Hello from Puerto Rico. Thank you. Hi. So welcome to Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 2, the Literature Review. Let's see, we have a support person on with us who can answer any kind of technical questions or just kind of business-related questions as we go through it. Any kind of content questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat box or the question and answer box. I won't get to them until the end, so it doesn't kind of interrupt things. Hey, so everybody can hear all right. I think everything, we're good. We got the slides up. Okay. Okay, so just a kind of quick overview of the Chapter 2, the Lit Review. It really is a kind of a snapshot of the more current, the better. Current state of research on your topic. So that's part of what it does, but it's also supposed to be kind of a big argument for your study and for your direction and your approach. So it kind of does two things. It kind of needs to kind of summarize to some extent the research that's out there on your topic, but it also, you need to be critical of the kind of research that's out there, kind of addressing some of the shortcomings, some of the things that the research doesn't cover. So therefore, it helps to make a case for why your study is needed. So it has that kind of dual function. So a lot of times your chairs will say, be more critical or be more analytical, and people are confused about that. I summarize the literature. What else do I need to do? Well, that's part of it. So again, and we'll talk a little bit more about it as we go through. So part of it too is being kind of critical toward the research. Again, like, look at trends, what's being left out. Maybe certain approaches are more in vogue and other approaches like yours are not. So part of it is being critical about weaknesses of studies, about gaps in the literature. Again, and all this should center around, what's needed in the research, and hence the reason why you're doing your study, the research problem. Okay. This represents what I have on the screen, a typical structure of chapter 2. Always, I'm going to say this 20 times at least throughout the presentation, get your school's template for the dissertation, for the chapters. Because while there are common elements, common structures and characteristics throughout the chapters, some schools will have there are specifics that they want. They may want, sections in a different order, or they may want headers called something specific. So always use your school's template. If your school doesn't have one, we have general templates on our website. You can also ask your chair for a template or for an example. Another important thing that I'm going to reiterate several times throughout, always have an example of a completed dissertation in your area from your school, not just for the sections and what the chapters are supposed to look like, but for the actual content, because some sections you can go to webinars, you can read about them, but when you sit down to write it, sometimes there's just nothing more helpful than just having an example or two to look at, just to see what people have put down. Okay, so the typical contents for the chapter 2, the Lit Review: the introduction, literature search strategy, theoretical framework, the review of the literature, which will be the bulk of the Lit Review, like 80% of it, and a summary. So for the introduction, like introductions for other chapters, restate the purpose of your study. And the purpose is like one of the areas, the purpose in the research questions is one of the areas that you can kind of restate it verbatim. professors don't like you pulling information from other parts of your study and just copying and pasting it. But for your research, your purpose, the purpose of this study is you can do that because it needs to be consistent. So restate your purpose at the beginning, remind the reader of the importance of your study, you know, why you're conducting it, what the research problem is. Again, just to kind of remind the reader, just to kind of reorient the reader. And you can preview the contents of the chapter if you want. This chapter will contain, you know, 8 sections, A, B, and C. Okay, sometimes, again, check your specific template. Sometimes schools want a section called something like literature search strategy. And this is basically a section that talks about how you conducted the search for the research on your topic. In other words, they just want to know that certain steps were followed. They want to know that they want to see the kind of search terms you used, the databases you searched. And the idea is that you want to convey to your reader that a sense of comprehensiveness about search, that you've completed a comprehensive search. In other words, that there's nothing you left out of your search or you missed, or if you missed something, you know, it was purely by accident, but that you cast a pretty tight net and nothing got through. And for this section, again, it's helpful to look at examples. But so the things you're going to want to talk about is, you know, say that you conducted a comprehensive search you're probably doing it online, your school library's online portal. List some of the databases and the search tools. You know, Academic Search Complete, Academic Search Premier. I mean, there's some of these search tools and the library websites that search multiple databases, right? If there's specific databases you use, you know, mention those. Google Scholar, almost everybody uses that. Also, you know, if you included any kind of specialized journals or specialized databases for your topic, mention those. Talk about the key terms that you used and the combinations of the terms that you use to search for material. And this won't be there's no surprises here. I mean, these are going to correspond to your variables, your factors, the major topics of your study. You also want to include any way you qualified your search or filtered your search. So, you know, if it was only English only, put that. If it was only full text, put that. But the real big ones are, you need to mention that you focus primarily on peer-reviewed academic articles and studies. The Lit Review is not a place for websites, books, things like that. You can use books sparingly if you have to. You can use information from websites if they're like government websites, if you need them for specific statistics. But what you're really doing is you're looking at peer-reviewed studies, academic studies and articles, and what researchers have done and found out about on your topic. So it's important to mention that you look for peer-reviewed sources. Also, the date of publications. This gets into a bigger issue of ideally literature reviews should be as recent as possible. In other words, you want the most recent data and the most recent studies for your study. I mean, we don't care really what happened 10 years ago, unless it's relevant for some reason now. So some schools will have cutoff dates, like you can't go back to research. All the research you use has to be 5 years, 5 years old, published within 5 years. That's pretty standard, 5 to 7 years sometimes. Some schools, it's even tighter. It's like 3 years, which is really tight. Some schools extend it out to 10. Some schools don't care. I mean, I've seen schools that they don't, use material from 20 years ago. Just, it doesn't matter. But generally speaking, again, follow the guidelines of your school. But generally speaking, you want to keep things as recent as possible. Just because, again, like I said, if something happened 20 years ago, it may not even be an issue anymore. If you do have to go back and use older studies, sometimes that's fine, but you should do so sparingly. And also, if there's a good reason to, like if something is foundational, and it's old, you can use it. Okay. Theoretical framework, again, consult your school's template. Sometimes a theoretical framework appears in chapter 2, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it appears in chapter 1. You mention it in chapter 1 and you go into more depth about it in chapter 2. So if it does appear in chapter 2 and it appeared in chapter 1, it's usually a more worked out version in chapter 2, a little more in depth. Okay, so the important components for the theoretical framework is, who developed the theory. First of all, just start with a simple declarative, statement that so-and-so's theory or such and such framework will be used for your study. Who developed the theory, the year, and what did they develop the theory to explain? Okay, if there's any components associated with the theory, especially as they relate to your study, you want to mention those, you want to define those. You want to discuss what researchers have used the theory for in general. And the important point is that, talk about how it connects to your study or how it, it helps to explain, it's going to explain and guide, what you're looking for. Okay, again, it's helpful to look at examples. Okay, and a word here about, because I know the question is coming, what's the difference between a theoretical framework and a conceptual framework? The short answer is theoretical frameworks are more typically associated with quantitative studies. Conceptual frameworks are more typically associated with qualitative studies. I don't know exactly why that is. I do know, though, that for quantitative studies, sometimes you have an entire theory that encapsulates what you're doing. Let's say leadership, you're doing a leadership study. So you're going to use the multi-factor leadership questionnaire, the MLQ, which is an instrument that measures different types of leadership. Now there's a theory of, those 3 kinds of leadership that are included on the survey. So you can just use that theory as your theoretical framework. For something like a qualitative study, you make, which are typically exploratory, you're not really sure what you're going to get. You're exploring the topic. So there may not be a theory that covers everything that you may get. So you may need to take a couple concepts, major concepts, and kind of put them together to create your own framework. So that's kind of the big difference between the theoretical framework and the conceptual framework. Also, for the theoretical framework, if you're doing a quantitative study, make sure that your theory and your instruments match. So, for example, if you're doing a study on emotional intelligence, well, there's a couple different instruments for measuring emotional intelligence, and they're based on similar but different theoretical tenets or theoretical propositions. So if you're measuring, so you want to use the theory for your theoretical framework that your instrument is based on. Okay, so let's just say there's 3 different instruments, for example, A, B, and C. So if you're using instrument A to measure emotional intelligence in your study, you don't want to use theory C for your theoretical framework. You see what I mean? So your instrument is going to have some kind of theoretical basis. You want to use the theory and the theoretical basis for your instrument, for your theoretical framework. So those should match in quantitative studies. Okay, the next section, the review of the literature. This is the big section. This is what everybody struggles with, and just a word of warning, not a warning, but just to be clear-eyed about it. It's long and it's kind of difficult. But having said that, I mean, it's manageable. Obviously, people write them. So here's some of the kind of the tips, and here's what it should look like. So it covers recent literature on your topic, specifically on your factors, what you're doing, the relationship, or whatever it is specifically that you're studying. You definitely want to use headers because you can have a lot of material in this section. So you need to section it out. It's going to make it more reader friendly for your readers. It's also going to make it writer friendly for you, because it's easier to compartmentalize information into sections and understand it yourself as a writer, rather than having just a glob of information that is going to overwhelm you. So how do you organize it? Well, you organize it, by your themes, or by your variables or your factors. And then within those sections, you have a section on your variable, your factor, your major concept. If there are themes that emerge from the literature, right? So everyone's going to be specific to your study, right? It's going to be, they're going to have headers that are associated with your specific topics and variables. But within the literature itself, if certain themes come up, or certain trends come up, or certain, there's commonalities, you may want to section that out as a subsection. Okay, and then discuss, research that discusses that theme or that trend. So it's typically, it's typical to organize sections, have a section introduction, introduce what you're going to talk about in that section, and then review studies on that topic. And the review should consist not only of summarizing, like, here's what the study was about, here's the population they studied, here's what they found, but should contain synthesis and analysis. And let's just focus on those two things real quick. Synthesis is just a general definition, is a combination of parts to form a whole. Right, so it's just bringing things together to form something bigger and a whole. So what you don't want to do is necessarily kind of the annotated bibliography style of summarizing your studies, right? That's Smith, analyzed, examined this topic, and they used this population, and they used this analysis, and here's what they found. Now Jones did it on something else, and it's one study after another. Now you have to stop and you have to describe studies in some detail, but then the idea is to see where the findings comment on one another. Okay, so anywhere where the findings differ, you may want to note that. Where they're common or they're similar, note that too. So you start to see trends. You start to see where some studies are the same or similar, or where some studies have different findings. that way you can kind of get a sense of the whole picture of the literature, how it all fits together, what's missing from the research, what are some of the weaknesses. And the best way to synthesize the information is at the paragraph level. And I'm going to kind of take you, back to, basics for the paragraph. And this is real basic, but example, but sometimes when we start writing about material that's challenging, and some of the material in these studies is challenging, and it's it may be new to you also, which also makes it challenging. It's easy to kind of get overwhelmed and forget that look, the paragraph structure hasn't changed. You still have a topic, you still have material that illustrates the topic, and you still have some kind of leading statement at the bottom or at the end of the paragraph, or some kind of summation statement. So, your paragraph structure should basically follow that. The only different thing is you're going to be talking about research on your topic. You're going to be making points by including the details from the studies you're reviewing. Analysis. So that's synthesis, bringing things together to make a larger point, noting where study findings are similar or different. Analysis, it just kind of involves, you can be critical. They want you to be a little critical of the studies. In other words, bring up weaknesses, bring up things that the researchers did not focus on, maybe something that you're focusing on. Again, that helps to make the case for the need for your study. So shortcomings or gaps of the studies, trends in the research, gaps in the research. Again, this helps to reiterate and make the argument for your study. And so the whole kind of lit review culminates in basically, here's what's been done in the literature. Here are the gaps, here are the weaknesses. Here's what we still need to do, hence the need for my study. And I know that's kind of a kind of seems like a quick overview of the review of the literature section, but that's kind of it. That's the big broad overview, and again, they're all different. So they need to follow, the structure needs to follow specifically your variables, your factors, and what's being found in the literature. When you get to the summary, recap the major points from the chapter, just like any summary, and make sure you actually recap the major points. I see summaries that aren't really summaries. They just say, well, in this chapter, I did this, and I did this. That's not a real summary. That's just kind of a list of what you did. So make sure you kind of recap the major points, remind the reader of the research problem and the need for your study, what's not in the literature, right? And reiterate why your study is needed or the research problem. This is our contact information. If you think you want to talk to somebody about more help or what we offer, here's the person you can contact. And yep, and I'll take questions. I did have a question from email before the webinar started, so I'll take that one. And if you have any specific questions, just let me know now. Just put it in the chat box. You can go ahead and type them out. So let's see, the one from email that I got, let me handle that one and then I'll take other ones, is my sources are outdated. However, I have at least 18 empirical research articles that I've read but not synthesized into the literature review. Do you have any suggestions for the task? Well, I hope I just kind of answered that in the presentation. If I didn't, or if you have something more specific about that, let me know. Yeah, I mean, if you have the material, you have the articles, what do I do with them? You know, part of it is pulling the, you know, you can take this in a two, you know, kind of a two-step process. Part of it involves pulling out the pertinent information from the articles. I mean, you have these big articles and it's like, you're going to have to distill them down into, you know, a few sentences, maybe a paragraph. So the important things are, you know, what was the purpose of the study? You know, maybe the participants in the study, that can be important. What kind of study was it? You know, qualitative, quantitative, how did they analyze the data and what the findings are? So if it's easy to pull that information out first out of all the studies and get it in one place before you start, sometimes that's helpful because you can see what they actually focused on. You can see what the findings are, and then you can kind of see trends and patterns and organize kind of like and dissimilar, you know, findings together. But again, you need to stick with your topics, you stick with your factors, stick with the actual things you're studying. The lit review is not a general discussion of literature on your topic. It's focused specifically on what you're doing. Okay. Let me see, I have others. Let's see. Do you have a template suggestion? Let me see. Okay. Do you have a template suggestion or where I can go to organize my literature? We do have templates on the website. There are templates. We have their general templates. But again, if your school or your chair has one specifically they want you to use that. How many articles are reasonable to include in a lit review when writing a dissertation? 50, 100 or more? How many articles? There's no set number. Now, some schools will give you a number. Some schools will say at least 75 or 80. If they give you a number, then try to stick to the number. You know, sometimes there's, you know, especially if they restrict the publications date to 5 years or even 3 years, that really restricts the number of articles. Yeah, so there's no hard and fast number, again, unless they give you one. Sometimes 50 is enough. Sometimes, you know, they don't really count if it just seems like you've covered the topic, and you have, you know, a good many sources that, you know, I've seen where they don't, the number isn't important. So again, I would say consult your template. If it doesn't say, just make it appear, and by appear, I just mean make it show them that you've done a comprehensive search and included everything that you thought was relevant. Okay, let's see, have other questions here. I have a question about qualitative research. Can you qualify to me? Is it better process? Let's see, may you qualify to me? Is it better to process the literature review only after finding the themes from the data? I'm not sure what you're asking. It sounds like the literature review comes first. No matter if it's qualitative or quantitative. And then obviously you collect data after that. And then if you're doing qualitative, typically after you analyze the data, the results come out in the form of themes, typically for qualitative. And then in chapter 5, you discuss whether what you found reflected in the themes aligns or doesn't align, or how it relates to the previous literature that you found in your lit review. What is the best way to prepare a theoretical framework and descriptive research? I'm not real sure what that means. Descriptive research, I'm assuming it's like you don't really have a hypothesis. It's just kind of exploratory and descriptive. For the theoretical framework, I mean, you're just going to have to get something that matches up as closely to what you're doing as possible. I mean, I don't know if there's a hard and fast kind of correlation between the theoretical framework and descriptive research. I guess it would depend on what it's descriptive about, like demographic information. If it's descriptive demographic information, then I think your framework would need to talk about why it's important to get that kind of demographic, have that kind of descriptive information, which may be particular to your topic. Regarding the age of the research and the literature review, what if you need to incorporate the history of a topic, but those articles go past the time frame? Do you use recent studies to recap the history instead? No, I think you get a pass. If you have to do, first of all, for historical background material in the lit review, it should have a kind of a relatively smaller place than the actual review of the literature. So if you need a historical section, that's fine. I don't think it needs to be too long though. And yeah, of course, if you're doing a historical section, you can use, you know, older material. Again, though, it's not going to be the focus of your lit review, so you shouldn't have to use too much material, older material. But yeah, obviously, if you're using doing a historical thing, I think that would be fine to use older sources. Is it okay to address population gap as well as other aspects of the topic under researched altogether in a dissertation study? Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but you only need, you only need one gap. I mean, you only need one research problem. You don't need multiple research problems or multiple gaps. In other words, you want it to be focused. So yeah, I mean, trying to address multiple gaps is not advised. Okay, a lot of questions. I've been told not to direct the lit review, which is difficult because I've identified a clear gap and would like to pursue that in the literature. Yeah, by that I'm guessing you mean that somebody's telling you to be objective and not to kind of make a case for your study in the lit review, which kind of goes counter to what I just said and what in my experience, lit reviews are about, is to make a case for your study. But the advice from your chair is going to kind of trump everything. So if your chair wants you to move in a certain direction, and you feel that's well advised, I mean, you can always get a second opinion from one of your, your committee members or somebody else. If your chair wants something specific, I would discuss it with them if you have questions. But at the end of the day, if they feel strongly about it, I would suggest you go with, what your chair says. So if they want a more kind of objective lit review, then maybe, gear it a little bit toward that. Do you recommend discussing methodology types? What about methodology critiquing them in the lit review as part of discussing the studies? Yeah, that's part of what you need to do. Now, it's like you don't want to get into methodology itself in the lit review, but the methodologies, yes, of the studies you're reviewing are part of the analysis. So what type of study was it? What was the approach, qualitative or quantitative? What was the design? Was it correlational? So yeah, those methodological issues when you're reviewing the studies matter. So yeah, you want to include that. And especially if something's like there's a trend, like a methodological trend, like on your topic, there's a lot of quantitative studies, but very few qualitative studies. And that helps you set up the need for your qualitative study. That would definitely be something you want to highlight. If there's like a methodological weakness in a study, yeah, you definitely want to highlight that. So yeah, methodologies in the lit review are important, but again, it's not a chapter on methodology, if that makes sense. Like your methodology and the way you discuss that is going to come later. But as far as critiquing and analyzing the methodologies of some of the studies, yes, that's part of it. Are there any cases where you don't follow a theoretical or conceptual framework, e.g. nutrition research? I don't know, really. All the studies that have come across my desk have involved a framework of some type. I imagine there could be. I don't know for sure. I haven't seen it, is all I can say. But these would be questions for your chair or your mentor, whoever you're working closely with. And again, based on your school's guidelines, and again, based on examples, what have people done in the past in that area? Can you please talk about how to discuss published synopses of research from professional organization poster sessions? For example, a poster session that presents racial breakdown of results from a larger published study without the actual publishing of more that the poster session. Okay, so it sounds like you're going to use the data, but it's not the actual original source. The best thing to do is to always go back to the original source if possible. Sometimes we can't, sometimes if it's, something published a long time ago or it's hard to get to, you have to use it as it's being quoted in something else. If it's just a convenience thing, like, well, yeah, this is only a study from 2015, I just don't want to go find it. Professors typically frown on that. They'll typically say, just go find the study and see what the study says. Now, it doesn't mean you have to. I mean, you could still use the information from the poster and just use the citation from the original study. That's fine too if it works. So yeah, I would just track down the original studies, or at least use the original citation, and only use the kind of quoted in method. Like that's like, say you're using the information, but it's quoted in something else. You only use that as a kind of a last resort. But again, so go to the original material if possible. Concerning the literature review portion of my proposal defense, what are some of the major points I should make sure I cover in my presentation? To cover everything would take too long for sure, but what would you recommend that I hit hard? Okay, that's a good question. This goes to the proposal defense, and it's related to the lit review. So in your proposal defense, you're going to talk about certain things, a lot of it having to do with your topic, what your topic is, your research problem, your purpose, your methodology. Where does the lit review come into the proposal defense? It doesn't really in a big way. And you're right. It's like, the lit reviews could be 50 pages. So what are you going to include? What are you not going to include? The best thing I've just seen people do is have a couple of slides called relevant literature. And you just kind of summarize, or you take out some of the major, some of the really major studies or the really major findings from the research that most directly relate to what you're doing. That's what I've seen people do most often. And again, I wouldn't go more than 2 or 3 slides and just have it called relevant literature or most relevant literature. Because in the presentation, they really don't care that much that you cover all that in the presentation itself. I mean, it's in the document. You just hit some of the most major points of the most major studies that most relevantly are connected to your study, if that makes sense. Would you recommend including systematic reviews and or meta-analysis information of my variables in the literature review, or just use that type of information for me to determine the gaps in the literature? Yeah, I don't know. It's just a systematic review, I think, is fine. You don't think you don't have to get the meta-analysis is a whole different kind of study, so in itself. So I think you could just use kind of a systematic review approach. Are we able to get this PowerPoint to review? Yes, everybody will be getting copies of the PowerPoint and the presentation. How do I organize a search for a scoping review? I'm not sure what a scoping review is. May have to come back to that, or if you could clarify it. Can you speak to the voice of a writer in the lit review? How do we balance our voice in reviewing the literature while remaining objective? Voice in academic writing, really, you don't have much of a voice in academic writing, and that's just the nature of the writing. A lot of it is objective. A lot of it is relying on paraphrased or previous research. There's very little use of first person. So your voice is an academic voice, really, and it is. And part of the characteristic of an academic voice is being objective. So you shouldn't have much of a voice at all. I mean, your kind of point of view comes into play, the kind of literature you're selecting and the tack you're taking and all that. But your voice is really kind of in the backseat. Oh, my apologies. What was your response to the systemic reviews and or meta-analysis question? Approach it more like a systemic review, because a meta-analysis is itself it can be a kind of study, which is not required for the lit review. Just kind of a systematic review. Okay, let me see. More questions. Sometimes feels like the literature review background and the methodology can begin to bleed together. Any thoughts on how to keep those clearly separated? Yeah, I mean, yeah, I get that. The methodology though should be, it should have specific components, like, what is your design? Why have you picked this design? What is this design designed to obtain? What kind of information? The background of the lit review really kind of can bleed over, and that's fine because you're going to have a background section in the introduction, which kind of sets up the research problem and kind of gives the reader a summary of some of the major camps of study. And then in the lit review later in chapter 2, there's going to be a little background, but it's going to be a lot of more current stuff, more current studies, and you're going to go deeper into the studies and deeper into the topic. And usually they're separated by, the backgrounds in chapter 1 and the lit reviews in chapter 2. And so you shouldn't have a lot of background in chapter 2. It should be really a lot of focus on the current studies. And any kind of background is handled in chapter 1, where you're kind of setting up the study and the need for it. For clarity, if I'm able to find an instrument to measure stereotype threat, then it cannot be my theoretical framework, correct? Okay, good question. So if you have an instrument to measure stereotype threat, you want your theory for your theoretical framework to correspond to whatever the theory is that the instrument is based on. So you want those two things to align. So there may be a kind of a stereotype theory or a stereotype threat theory that the instrument is based on, because all instruments are based on theory somewhere. You know, that gives them their theoretical existence, really. So whatever theory or concepts, even it could be, or it could be theories, but whatever theory that your stereotype instrument is based on should be the theory for your theoretical framework. Is it ever acceptable to use relevant academic journals that are not peer-reviewed or to cite newer dissertations? You can, use journal articles that are not peer-reviewed. I mean, you can. Really, it's just if someone notices, if someone like your chair really digs in and says, "Oh, this isn't peer-reviewed," and sometimes they do. So you want to use things that are peer-reviewed. I suppose you can, use things that are not peer-reviewed. Newer dissertations, I mean, if there's something, I would use dissertations sparingly because they're dissertations, they're not peer-reviewed. If there's something specific or a point or, something you really need it for, sure, I go ahead and use it. But you don't want to be kind of citing dissertations, on a regular basis. Okay, let's see, more questions. Is it, okay, I just answered that one. I was more asking some literature will have researchers who conducted systematic reviews or meta-analysis studies on a specific variable. Oh, yeah, I see. So studies that are themselves like lit reviews or meta-analyses, yeah, you can include those. I mean, I've seen chairs once in a while say, "Oh, this is a lit review. It's not a real study." I mean, but for the most part, I've seen that you can include lit reviews and meta-analyses in your lit review. For the most part, your chair may have a problem with it. But I would default to using them unless you hear otherwise, because they are legitimate studies. And I had one more from the email. Let me see if I can find it here. How can the researcher address her own objective experience knowledge in the literature review, because this could be used as a relevant background for his or her research? Scholars, particularly those who had a practical engagement in the area of the investigation, are believed to have an objective experience, but may not have data to support the practical knowledge. I think what's being asked is that if you have certain knowledge as a practitioner, because it's an area you work in, where does that fall, or where does that fall into the literature review, or how can you bring that into the literature review, or do you use that knowledge to kind of critique the studies? Yeah, your personal experience, while valuable in certain areas, for the study isn't that valuable. And again, not to say that it's not valuable. For the purposes of the study, it's not. Yeah, things need to come really from the literature. And even though you can kind of confirm things on your own based on your personal experience, or kind of be skeptical of things based on your personal experiences, that kind of subjectivity I would keep out of the study. There's going to be places for you to make comments on the practical implications in chapter 5 of your findings, and that would be the place to kind of maybe bring in some of your insights about practice. But yeah, your practical experience, again, it's valuable, but for the purpose of the study, not so much. Okay, those are a lot of questions, but that's good. Those are good questions. Any other questions before I let you go? Again, everybody will be receiving a copy of this. Call us, contact us if you're interested in more information about what we do. Just remember, the chapter 2 is it's difficult, but you can get through it. Take it by sections, section the lit review portion out based on your topics and your variables. It's very specific. It's not a general discussion. Again, if it helps to pull information out of the studies that you've pulled, the articles, to pull the information out first about the topic, the research design, the findings. Sometimes that helps. Pull all that information out first, have it in a separate file. All right, well, great. Well, thank you for attending and good luck. And we hope to hear from you if you have questions. All right, thank you.